of interesting to hear the other people's.
Yeah, that's the other, there were other papers from an Israeli war researcher.
Young guy who has been in jail or was going back to jail, I can't remember, because he was really high debt. And he likes sci-fi.
Not much of a crowd here, right?
Well, where's the chair? That's what I want to know. I'm just making sure we're in the right room,
Yeah.
which
So
I
there's
think
gonna be a chair.
Jim Farney, who's from University of Regina,
Oh.
he was brought in as the the only one who would do it. It's disgusting. It really pisses me off. This is what has led to me being terminated, this kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty pissed. 611, we're in the right room, SGA. But, like, it's shameful. I see it as being shameful, not standing up for academic freedom, being just, completely,
Yeah.
Captured. Yeah.
It is,
Can you hear? So I'm live streaming it right now. Can you hear me, Daniel? Yep, Daniel can hear me. My video. Daniel was Daniel Page, the videographer who did Mount Royal University Murders, Academic Freedom, and the University of No, no one can say anything on this. They're just listening to it. I'm going to move this over.
Somebody's glasses said that.
Yeah, I know.
Like the good ones?
Can't see. Someone just left them. They got nothing to do with us.
There's somebody fumbling around looking at their glasses.
Move it this way out of here.
Wait a minute, I can't find my glasses.
Now I need them really a lot for reading.
So we're waiting for the chair, because I can't set up my computer stuff unless I have the.
The chair to do it. So it can look her up.
It's probably just the chair, maybe.
No, cataracts.
Oh, I did too. I didn't remember. Still not working.
I'm okay for distance, but for reading.
Hello.
Hi there.
Well, I'm not on the board.
You're not the chair.
I'm not the chair. Jim Farney is the chair.
Hi, Jim. We haven't met before. But yes, thank you very much.
It's good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I assume it's okay if I live stream this.
Would be unconventional, but
There's no one else going. Well, I won't turn it on anyone else. There will be no ones on. I'm the only person presenting. So anyway, if you don't want to set up this thing.
that was a good question. I haven't had to do it myself, this one. Are your slides on a USB key?
Yes, they are.
It says that you put your key in the port, which is right there. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Very nice. No, you don't play well. He did. Yeah, he was fine. Yeah. What did you do? 76. What did you do? Oh, I did,
Oh, I see.
his brother, I worked for his brother in the advertising.
John, have you done a presentation on this system?
Thursday, Friday, about a week before.
There's a way of hooking my
I've seen other people.
I prefer to use this.
This, yeah, that's fair. I have
we
not
trying to do?
presented on this system, so I don't even know how to log in.
So, there should be, there's a lot of information in Congress over there, but I don't see it. So let's see. Here, this is Congress specific.
Yep, power computer on by priority is on. But usually I don't want to do that. I just want to use, I have a USB that I've.
Yeah, the USB can go in here.
Yep.
in the spot there.
Yep.
It's easy to make it to sign in.
I just need someone to sign in.
Yeah, and there is this, I've seen in other ones, there's been like some instructions here, but I just don't, right here. So,
Oh, very good.
try those.
Congress 01@georgebrown.ca.
There we go.
And then this needs to be turned on somehow. I don't know what the.
Yeah, I mean, the other two screens are on.
Okay, that's
So,
fine. I don't need this one.
I'm not sure why
No,
that
we
was
don't
not
need that one.
functioning.
$146. I'm good.
So my name's Jim Barney, but I'm chairing, which I think in a small group like this and a quiet room towards a fairly straightforward. Frances is the only paper we've got for the day. She tells me she would like to live stream, so when we get to Q&A, if there is a Q&A, we may have to dial that down a little bit, we'll see, but no problem with your presentation at any rate. So I will let you take it away in the conventional paper presentation.
And I should mention there's some glasses that were left here. I don't know if they're anyone's. I'll just leave them there because they're, anyway. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I'm a political scientist. It's actually been, I believe, since 2019. That was the last time I was here at Congress. And I just wanted to let people know that I looked at the code of conduct before doing my presentation, and it says it's harassing and bullying behavior to make a victim feel unsafe or to engage in conduct that damages the reputation of the Federation, which is a very difficult thing to determine as to how this is going to happen, because in my case, when I asked questions about Indigenous science, that was made to feel, someone felt unsafe by me asking questions about Indigenous science. So I'm just going to assume, with respect to this presentation, that discussing ideas not targeting particular individuals and so on is totally acceptable conduct for an academic conference where we should be able to discuss ideas fearlessly as long as we are not, disparaging particular individuals. Anyway, so in terms of what I would like to talk about, my paper is about criminalizing residential school denialism, and what are the academic and political implications. I think from an academic standpoint, asking what residential school denialism would be a good start. This is not self-evident because it would appear from the terminology that would mean you're denying the existence of the residential schools, but that's not what residential school denialism means as is defined by a number of people. There has been a couple of years whereby it is proposed that residential schools denying residential schools is going to be criminalized, and I want to just talk about how that came about. And then what we're finding with respect to the whole discussion about residential school denialism is there's a question about truth. We're going to see that there's a question about truth that is going to emerge. How do we define truth? And is what is being demanded in terms of accepting discussions about the nature of residential schools, does that demand that falsehoods be accepted? And then finally, I want to talk about my own experiences over the last, 5 to 10 years, where I have gradually been pushed out of discussions that have happened because of this movement for criminalization, and now we have a threat. It hasn't actually happened yet, but if we do criminalize residential school denialism, that is going to mean that the state is going to impose punishments upon people for saying what they think is true. And I think this is an incredibly dangerous development that is happening in Canadian society, and it is going to have massive implications for discussing the nature of the residential schools. And maybe the things that people put forward are not correct, they're flawed, but the way in which we're going to figure out what's true or not true is not through a process of criminalization. So regardless of what one's views are on the residential schools, I would hope that as academics, we would think that criminalizing discussions about the residential schools is not going to be beneficial for improving our understanding about this area. So that's generally what I propose that I am going to be talking about. And since it's a small group, if people have questions before, as we go along, I think that'd be fine. So before I begin, does anyone have any questions about what I'm planning on doing? All right. Okay, so what is residential school denialism? And I should mention that these slides are all available. They're on the wokeacademy.info site. These 8 people that are on this slide are people who have said that residential school denialism is a thing. So they're arguing that residential school denialism exists, whatever that may be. The most prominent person who has made this argument is the academic Sean Carlton, who's from the University of Manitoba. He has made many, many arguments over the last couple of years, I guess starting around 2020, but there's numerous other people. Negon Sinclair, and actually I should mention Sean Carlton and Negon Sinclair are doing an event next week on something to do with residential school denialism. That's going to be happening. I just signed up for that event, so that's going to be interesting. Keisha Supernantis, the other person. Daniel Heath Justice wrote this very famous piece with Sean Carlton. Pamela Palmater, Crystal Fraser, and then 2 Mount Royal University professors who are my university have also made arguments about how residential school denialism is a problem, and that is Travis Hay, who's a historian, and Gabrielle Weaselhead, who is a Indigenous Studies scholar. So, the question then is, what is residential school denialism? And the person who has made the most arguments with respect to residential school denialism is the professor Sean Carlton from the University of Manitoba. And he was, as far as I can determine, I did a bit of a search of the words residential school denialism, and I found that he was the first person who has actually had these words together. I do a bit more of a time scale type of thing and how it originated, but this is the first time I've seen these words. And in an academic paper, I believe in 2021, Sean Carlton defined residential school denialism as the rejection or misrepresentation of basic facts about residential schooling to undermine truth and reconciliation efforts in Canada. So that's how that is defined. So it's not just denying facts, denying basic facts, it's the denial of those facts, whatever they may be, that undermine what's called truth and reconciliation efforts. So those two things going together constitute residential school denialism. So it's not denying the existence of the residential schools, it's denying basic facts that undermine truth and reconciliation efforts. So that raises the question, what are the basic facts that are being denied? And how does the denial of these basic facts undermine truth and reconciliation efforts? And in the paper, I don't have enough time to go through this right now, but in the paper, what I generally came to discover is there's a number of different things that are talked about in terms of these basic facts, which are contested ideas. Like, they're not facts. Whether or not the residential schools were well-intentioned or not, that's something that would have to be investigated to determine what each person involved in the residential schools intended to do in their role. And there's a variety of different people that are involved in this process. So you can't just say that saying some people are well-intentioned is somehow denying a basic fact. So these are contested kind of ideas. I haven't really found any kind of basic facts that these so-called residential school denialists, of which I have been singled out as one of those people. Tom Flanagan is another major figure who's been singled out in this. It's not very clear as to what's being talked about. And then undermining truth and reconciliation efforts. As we're going to see, truth is often not what people think truth is. So truth, in terms of its general dictionary definition of truth, is, the extent to which one's ideas correspond with reality. That would be a sort of a measure of truth. Often that's not what's meant by truth. It is whatever survivors say is the case, people who are claimed to be residential school survivors. So if they say that Queen Elizabeth II abducted 10 children from the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and they believe that's the case, that's their truth, and that's often what's meant by truth. And not believing those claims, it's argued, somehow has some negative effect on reconciliation, which tends to be trying to figure out how to live with one another, some kind of approach which is going to make people understand one another more. That's very much in dispute as to what that means as well. So according to Sean Carlton, it's not very clear what these basic facts are. Sometimes it seems to be, if you reject the idea that the residential schools are genocidal, that's residential school denialism. And you can sort of see that in the discussion, because there's parallels that are drawn between denying that the residential schools were harmful and so on, if that's the case, with Holocaust denial. That's a parallel that is drawn all the time. And denying the Holocaust is denying that the Holocaust was the genocidal act against Jewish people in Nazi Germany. similar parallels are drawn with respect to the residential schools. So that's often what we see as residential school denialism. If you deny that the residential schools are genocidal, you are accused of being engaged in residential school denialism. That often is where you end up in this discussion, but as I wanted to repeat, it's not very clear as to what the basic facts are that we are talking about with respect to this matter. Okay, so that's what residential school denialism is. What about criminalization? How did this sort of demand for criminalization come about? So we can sort of say, okay, there's this thing called residential school denialism. Some people might be opposed to people contesting the idea of the residential schools being genocidal, but a few years ago that never would have been argued that you should make that illegal, that you should be put in jail for 2 years if you do that, or if you deny other aspects of the way the residential schools were, you should have some kind of criminal punishment that is going to be imposed upon you. But this happened in 2024. So the criminalization, the argument for criminalization, was put forward by Leah Gazan, who is an MP for Winnipeg Centre, and she put forth this proposal, Bill C-413. Of course, with the election, this bill died, so it's no longer actually in motion, but there was a lot of sympathy for her position, and possibly sympathy within the government. So it still is there in the wings, waiting in the wings, potentially to be brought forward. And the way she characterized residential school denialism is, again, similar to Carleton, but downplaying basic facts about the residential schools, causing harm by doing this, these sorts of things, and you should be able to be imprisoned for up to 2 years in this bill if you do what is stipulated to be downplaying the harmful effects of the residential schools. This didn't come out of nowhere, so it didn't just happen overnight, this proposal. It was linked to 2 other things that occurred. The first one was in October 2022, Gazan also put forward a motion that was passed unanimously in the House of Commons, which was a motion that the residential schools were genocidal. And that was the second time in trying to do that. She originally did it in 2021. That did not pass unanimously. In 2022 it did, in part because the Pope Francis, on his flight back to the Vatican, was entered into a question and answer period, and he admitted at that time that he thought that the residential schools were genocidal. So that action by the Pope was something that seems to have some impact in making this a unanimous agreement on this idea. And then the second thing that happened was also in 2022. This was an amendment, I believe, to the budget, whereby it was Bill C-619, which made Holocaust denial, criminalized Holocaust denial, but it wasn't just denying facts about the Holocaust. It was denying facts about the Holocaust in the context of promoting hatred against Jews. So you might have taken issue with the numbers of people who died in the Holocaust, or that sort of kind of factual discussion. That wouldn't be criminalized. But if you were saying something about some kind of Jewish conspiracy that led to this happening, and were vilifying Jewish people because of this kind of denial of these facts, then that would be something that would be considered to be illegal. So this raises the question, is that these efforts to criminalize what's called residential school denialism, is there a parallel between that and Holocaust denial? And I think it's not really comparable in my view, because one, we have evidence of mass murder in the case of the Holocaust and intentional attempts to destroy Jews as an ethnic group. in the case of the residential schools, we do not have that evidence, it seems to me. And even if you're wrong, and there was an attempt to destroy Aboriginal people as a group with respect to the residential schools, you're not doing it to necessarily to vilify Indigenous people. You're just saying, you and I have a disagreement about the factual character of why the residential schools were brought into existence. This makes no statement about, what I think about, Aboriginal people as a group and so on. So I think trying to portray people who are contesting facts about the residential schools with people who are engaged in Holocaust denial is not a legitimate comparison. And that kind of aspect is discussed in the paper that is available for people if they want to watch that, if they want to take a look at that paper. So that's how the criminalization came about. And I should mention, Leah Gazan, who is the MP who brought forward this sort of bill on residential school denialism, she said on January 20th, 2025 in Powell River, which I have a recording of, that she can't think of anything more violent than someone sharing their story and for someone to say you're lying. This is in comparison to known atrocities such as, Auschwitz and Rwanda, where people were hacked apart with machetes, to, the death squads in Latin America. That's an absurd statement. And for people to be taking Leah Gazan seriously when this is the kind of thing that she thinks is violent, doesn't make any sense in an academic context. So that's just a bit of background information about the person who is trying to criminalize statements like people like me who are not trying to deny anything harmful about the residential schools and just taking issue with some of the claims about the remains of 215 children being found at the Kamloops Senior Residential School. Okay, so we hear all the time, and I believe it's Murray Sinclair, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You hear this repeated over and over again, that you cannot have reconciliation without truth. So truth is needed before we can have reconciliation. That's the claim. So in order for us to, sort of make amends and to figure out a better way to live with one another, to recognize some of the problems that existed in the past and correct them, we need to base that on a factual understanding of reality. That seems to me to be the claim that's being made by people like Murray Sinclair. However, when we look at what is meant by truth, so how are we defining truth? It turns out that what is the general acceptance of the idea of truth is not what is meant by many of the people who are talking about residential school denialism. And what they're doing is they're following the postmodern trend that happened in the 1960s, whereby the idea of the pursuit of an objective truth, that is trying to figure out an understanding of reality that everyone shares, that is being rejected in these discussions. And what it is that the idea is that different groups have different truths, and if you don't accept the idea that's being put forward by a group that is perceived to be oppressed, then you are denying their humanity, these kinds of rhetorical kinds of strategies that are happening. And that is directly related, that relativization of the idea of truth, which is this universal attempts to reach a common understanding, that is, in the university system, is linked directly to what's called identity politics, which is the idea that groups will become empowered and able to fight against oppression if you affirm what they believe to be true. That seemed to be an essential aspect of enabling them to become empowered. That was in the universities in the late 60s and has been becoming more and more prominent ever since. And then we have the more recent incarnation of this, which began in the 2000s, whereby you now became a bureaucratic kind of development, whereby you want to increase the proportion of groups that are perceived to be oppressed in institutions like the universities. So if there's 7% of Indigenous people in Alberta, for example, universities should have 7% of the students be Indigenous and 7% of the professors should be Indigenous. And if that's not happening, it's an indication of some kind of discriminatory action and the fact that you are not making those groups feel that they're included. And so this leads to all sorts of attempts to stop people from making arguments that make Indigenous scholar activists feel upset. That happens. I'm not kidding. So, and I've experienced this myself time and time again, where I am trying to make arguments about the residential schools, notably the Kamloops case, but there's no evidence that the remains of 215 children have been found, and it's a highly improbable claim because not one parent has stated that their child went missing from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So I'm saying that this is highly improbable, and an Indigenous scholar activist says that's very upsetting to me because my elders and all these things say that children died and they're buried in the apple orchard and so on. This seems to me as to be an unworkable demand in an academic context, because we're talking about facts that people have to agree that are the case or not the case. Whether or not there's 215 children buried in the apple orchard, that's an empirical question that can only be determined through excavations. And although $12.1 million have been allocated for excavations for the Kamloops case, those excavations have not been done. So we do not know whether this is the case or not. And so what we're seeing is knowledge about important matters, such as Kamloops, cannot occur and cannot be disseminated in the university system, because it's argued that if an Indigenous scholar activist hears this and they become upset, they'll leave the university and go somewhere else. So therefore, the person who's making those arguments should no longer be at that university, because this means that they're not going to be able to interact, in a way which is going to be warm and welcoming and so on with Indigenous scholar activists. So, in terms of the knowledge development, what we're seeing, and this is specifically with respect to the Kamloops case that I'm talking about, which is one of the major arguments behind why it's claimed that the residential schools are genocidal, is because there was it was claimed 215 children were buried in the apple orchard, which is clandestine burials, and so why would children be buried clandestinely unless there wasn't some kind of mass, murder or mass killing or mass death of some kind? This is largely, it's possible that this is due to people just misremembering what has happened. So people, and this has been documented in other contexts. So there was a case in the 80s and 90s where it was called the Satanic Ritual Abuse Panic, where a whole bunch of people argued that children had been killed because of these satanic rituals. That there's no evidence of that happening. But people truly believe that this had happened because they were in therapy sessions, they heard other people making these claims. It is possible, it is one of the possible circumstances that in all those truth and reconciliation hearings where you had many, many emotional people coming together, hearing stories, that other people, absorb those memories. And this is entirely a possibility that happened with respect to Kamloops, the Kamloops case especially. And then we have what's called the consensus effect, which is if you intimidate people in the university system and prevent them from saying what they think is true, you will develop a false consensus within universities, where everyone thinks that the 215 children were found in the Kamloops case, because no one is able to contest that, because if they contest it, it's seen as being residential school denialism. So we're building up a system that instead of disconfirmation happening within the universities, we have almost a forced consensus that is occurring because of the climate that exists within university system. And as a result of that, I believe it's 60% of the Canadian public, this was in, I believe, 2023, this was Eric Kaufman's report for McDonald Laurier, 60% of the Canadian public believes that the remains of 215 children have been found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and therefore, if you have that situation, it just appears that there might have been some kind of genocidal intent to the residential school system. And so, what this will mean is that if we're going to be arguing that we need to have truth, which is an accurate understanding of reality, to be able to develop a better way of interacting with one another, that we do not have that anymore, because we do not have the pursuit of truth in the university system, which is needed to figure out what is a better way to develop things. You're going to have no way of evaluating whether the way of approaching how to deal with Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations is a better one than existed previously. So the idea is that truth is a very important thing in its own right, just to develop an understanding about things, but it's also very important politically, because if you don't have a common understanding, you can't figure out the path forward, which is going to be evaluated in terms of improving circumstances between various groups. So that's, I think, we have a disastrous situation which is unfolding with respect to the residential schools being studied in an academic context in various universities around the country. So, in terms of my own case, I have in-depth experience with this situation. I've been studying the residential schools since 2016, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came out. I decided that I thought that was a flawed report, and I wanted to analyze that report. And I remember having a conversation with a colleague at this time, and I told the colleague that I was going to study the residential schools, and they said, "Be careful." And that was something that was turned out to be true. I really, at the time, I really thought the university system was in a much more robust kind of framework than turned out to be the case. This has been happening at the Canadian Political Science Association, this difficulty in discussing things like the residential schools. It has been actually enabled by the Canadian Political Science Association. Starting in 2008, when I was at a panel, when a member of the audience yelled, "Why do you hate Aboriginal people?" And there was an attempt by the Women's Caucus of the Canadian Political Science Association to have me charged under hate speech provisions of the Criminal Code. That happened. It did not go through, but from that time on, I was never allowed to sit in a panel with other people who were talking about Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations. So I was effectively ostracized from discussions about these matters, preventing myself from developing a better understanding and preventing all the other participants who are talking about Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations from having the benefit from my criticisms on that panel. So we never had that. This year, because I haven't been at the CPSA for a number of years due to my battles with Mount Royal University, I was on a panel initially, but I wasn't taken off, but the other people were taken off, and the discussion was taken off. I've never been given an answer as to why that happened. It was not due to scheduling problems. I could have been anywhere, any place, anytime on another panel. I don't know what happened there, but it's happened to Albert and me in the past. I'm not saying it happened here, where people on a panel complained about being with us, and we were moved to another location. That should never happen at an academic conference. As an academic, you are obligated to listen to views with which you disagree and provide constructive commentary about how those ideas can be improved. That is not happening in the academic realm anymore because of this equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology, which is if an Indigenous scholar activist gets upset about what you say, everyone should take this really seriously. I'm sorry, you're an academic. You have to put your personal feelings aside and grapple with the ideas that are before you. That's what needs to happen, and that is not happening in professional associations or in universities across the country, resulting in incredibly flawed information happening within university systems. Other things that started to happen to me, my publishers were boycotted, and this is Ian Mosby, who's a professor at what used to be called Ryerson University, who was encouraging other people to just boycott my publishers if they continued to publish my work. That happened. Secondly, the poisoning of my workplace after I did a presentation at the Canadian Political Science Association in 2017, and gradually you get the students who don't think that you have a right to be making arguments that make Indigenous scholar activists feel upset, and that deprives the university of much needed, counterbalancing forces to try to understand things. And now we are where we are right now, which is criminalization. There can be nothing worse for the pursuit of truth than criminalizing ideas. If you don't like an idea and you think it's wrong, that should be hashed out in the academic context to figure out what's wrong with it. And John Stuart Mill, who's, I think, the most prominent, still his ideas have resonance today. I don't think they've even been improved upon. Even if an idea is wrong, it's good to hear it in contest with your idea, because that enables you to develop a more complete understanding of why your idea is truthful. And he said, if you don't have that, truthful ideas become dead dogma, because people do not understand anymore why those ideas are true. So I really hope that that thing that Leah Gazan was doing, that was just a moment of madness, and we will realize that there's nothing worse for academic discussions than doing that. And all academics right now need to fight against the criminalization of ideas, because we will not be able to discuss very, very important issues such as the residential schools in universities today. Thank you very much.
So, I'll say two things. So Dr. Widdowson raises a lot of contentious stuff in that talk, as she promised to all the start. So underline the kind of ethics and engagement piece. The other thing that, as chair, I've never had to do before, but I'll remind folks that you're live streaming it. I'm not quite sure what to do with questions, but I think we might as well at this point treat it as a public event and remind people of that. If you have any questions or comments to make, some people engage differently, others don't. So I'll leave it to there, turn it to the audience. Other questions, comments.
And no one will see anyone's face, so you won't be identified. But I should mention as well is that I think in my case, it's very important to have a record of what exactly was said, because in my situation at Mount Royal, a number of people made up things which were not true about me. And so I cannot really speak publicly anymore without a record being made of what is actually said, because people either misremember or are intentionally trying to, cause a situation where I'm going to be, criminally charged for some kind of outrageous thing that I did not say.
Can I just want to comment that the combination of the terms truth and reconciliation as a unit is very rhetorical. It assumes that truth will create a reconciliation of something, but we haven't shown that anything has to be reconciled in the first place.
Well, I think many people have shown that think there's something to be reconciled.
Well, then they should state what it is.
Well, I think that I don't think that's really
It's
under.
up to us to do that. I don't believe it's the case.
Well, I think in numerous articles it's indicating that there is, first of all, a great deal of distrust, which exists.
What?
A great deal of distrust. A great deal of
That's not nothing to do with the argument. Somebody's distrustful or distasteful or how I feel about something has nothing to do with the intellectual concept, with the intellectual idea.
Well, I think there have been many people making arguments about that there is this distance that exists between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canadian society. There's a conflict, there's a difficulty that we need to work through to figure out a more cooperative society that benefits everyone. And there's numerous arguments about this as to what the nature of the problem is, which we need to figure out in more detail, I would argue, and I don't think that's happening very functionally in the academic context because, as I mentioned, one is the relativization of truth, which prevents us from saying, okay, here, we now agree this is the nature of the problem. We can't do that because truth is relative, which means that,
Truth is relative?
according to this view of truth and reconciliation, I'm saying you can't have reconciliation unless you have a universal conception of truth, would be my position.
Well, reconciliation means something has to be reconciled. Sorry for the repetition.
Yes.
But we have to say, well, what is it that has to be reconciled about the truth?
It's not about the truth that has to be reconciled. It's about,
What is reconciliation?
no, but the argument is that you need truth before you can have reconciliation. So we need to understand what the nature of the conflict is, or the harm that's been caused, or the reason for why the relationship's not working properly.
That's a big context.
So that's needed first, and it's Murray Sinclair who put this forward. So I don't think anyone is disagreeing that that's the case. It's really the definition of what's meant by truth and what's meant by reconciliation, which is the disagreement that's existing. But I would argue that I don't think that these discussions are very complete because of the intimidation that has been happening for the last at least 15 years, and it became terrible starting in around 2020. Yeah, Dennis.
I have two things to say. One's a question. With regard to truth, any divide is supposed to, reconciliation is supposed to overcome. I think there's a lot of agreement by a lot of people, and that it might be true that in some cases, treaty obligations have not been honored.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a place
Yes.
where both sides could agree there's truth and start to reconcile.
Yeah.
And I'd like, first of all, what you might have to say about that. Secondly, this goes back to the person who said you shouldn't publish with McGill Queens.
Mm.
Did McGill Queens respond at all to that?
No.
Thank you.
No, so that's the second question. So, but the problem is if McGill Queen, they didn't respond, but you can imagine a publisher, if they've got a whole, especially if they've got a large Aboriginal kind of catalog kind of area, and they have people saying to them, look, we're not going to work with you, we're not going to do this if you publish this work. Now, you might just have the publisher says, well, you do whatever you think is right, but we have an integrity here, and we're not going to be intimidated by this kind of pressure. That's one possibility, but you can sort of see how that would have at least would give a publisher sort of pause to think about things. But it's more, someone like Ian Mosby doing that. Like, he did that. He's going to be held to account for doing that, and a bunch of my colleagues supported him in doing that. Right? But no one cares. Like, that's the problem. Like, they don't care that we have this terrible situation in universities. Now, why we have that situation is an interesting question. But first of all, we have to be concerned about that happening. But there doesn't seem to be very many people who are going, whoa, that shouldn't be happening. Because they say, well, so-and-so Indigenous scholar activist is very upset, and we've got to do something about this. It's like, just because someone is upset, it doesn't mean it's valid as to why they're upset. And we have to take this seriously, because if you're going to just listen to everyone who gets upset, you're not going to have a university anymore.
Well, we're looking for objectivity here.
But anyway, I have to answer Dennis's, your first question, Dennis, which was about the treaty. So that would be the factual question. So is that true? And then you have a bunch of arguments about that. And then you have the kind of the normative argument. Like, I think that if you have, within a liberal democratic system, if you have legal obligations which have not been met, if you don't meet those legal obligations, you throw the whole system into disrepute. So I think it's something that should be of a concern in a liberal democratic context. Whether that is a real, number one priority for why there's terrible problems, and I should state this, the biggest problem for me with respect to Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations is not the fact that Ryerson University was called Ryerson University or anything like that, not because someone didn't do a territorial land acknowledgement, like we didn't do a territorial land acknowledgement at the beginning of this presentation. That doesn't matter to the most important segment, which is there are terrible social conditions in isolated Aboriginal communities that need to be addressed, which are not being addressed. And all this stuff happening with all this performative types of things don't do anything for the whatever percentage of fetal alcohol syndrome which exists in these isolated communities, which need to be taken on seriously before you have, massive, it's already state of emergency, but nothing's being done about it. And this is something that has to be addressed, but all these kinds of performative things really have nothing to do with it, and they're just virtue signaling of a bunch of non-Indigenous academics who think they're very morally superior by the fact that they do territorial land acknowledgements. Besides imposing a prescribed doctrine upon everyone in the Canadian Political Science Association, which should not be happening at all. We should be discussing whether it's true what's being stated in these land acknowledgements. Not, this is going to be what we're saying as an official prescribed doctrine of the Canadian Political Science Association. The fact that we're doing that is a rather shocking situation in my view.
I have probably a very dumb question, but it's, my understanding is that the kids that went to these schools had already been converted to Christianity, but they wanted to or not. That, wouldn't there be some sort of records of Christian burials, or these children denied Christian burials? Is that the idea that they were not somehow been allowed to have a Christian burial, or? I find the whole story very confusing. I don't understand why the parents of the children weren't pursuing any issues, especially if they were coming from the same community and there'd be several parents that would have had children missing. I don't understand the backstory of that at all, but I would like to say that the racism in Alberta against Indigenous people when I was there was incredibly bad. I mean, it was shocking, and I think that they could do a lot of reconciliation on that kind of thing. But I just don't understand the whole residential school, the children missing and this many children, and it it doesn't follow any kind of logic. These were mostly Christian schools. I think there were some government ones, but the reason why I'm worried about the Christian burial thing is because when I took physical anthropology at U of A,
Yeah.
the skeletons we worked on were Métis skeletons from a Christian burial. They were dug up and put at the university lab. Nobody agreed to that. It just was done. And with all the, the coffin nails and the clothing and the buttons from the shirts, and we're supposed to analyze this. And these were Christian burials, and they, so in that time, when I was at university, people took Christian burials seriously. They didn't worry about other people's burials, but they took Christian burials very seriously.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, why weren't they taken seriously for the children? If they were being buried in large numbers in places like the Apple or whatever, why weren't they being buried by Christians, as Christians, in a Christian burial? Do you understand what I mean?
Okay,
Like,
so there's a number of different issues. So it has to do with also. So what are the claims that are being made? So there's a couple things. One is the reconciliation issue, like the racism that's existed historically, and this is the question: is that those we have to figure out what that was and how to rectify that and so on. But that requires truth to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about the whole burials question, which is a massive, and this is something that a research group and about 25 people have been working on since the Kamloops announcement was made in May 2021.
Well, aren't there records?
They're spotty. The records are spotty because of like certain areas were burned, like the church burned down or whatever, so those records got burnt. That's one thing. Secondly, the government at some point, as part of its supposed house cleaning, just got rid of a whole bunch of stuff too. So we don't have complete records. Also, for death certificates, which are one of the most important documents, you have to be a family member who requests a death certificate from Vital Statistics to get that death certificate. So they're just not publicly available. Those are all kinds of the documents. The issue most of the time so Kamloops, there's no evidence of burials in the apple orchard at Kamloops, and it's highly improbable that's the case. This seems to be a deception that was perpetrated by the Kamloops Indian Band with a whole bunch of other factors that are just being disentangled now as to what went on. For example, the GPR expert, Sarah Bollier, was selected not because she was an expert, but because she was a culturally sensitive academic who would be drawn in to this kind of emotional types of discussions. You need to do GPR, you need to be a geophysicist, and you have to understand the technical things about this. And Sarah Bollier didn't have any understanding about this and told the band that because of the nature of these anomalies, it looked like 3-year-old children were buried in these 215 anomalies. 3-year-olds. That's why you got in the press release in May 2021, children as young as 3 years old. That evidently, according to Ted Godfredson Jr., came from Sarah Bollier, who told them that this looks like it's 3-year-old children that are buried. Yes, so that, but like these are all issues that need to be investigated in a very, very systematic way. So this happened. Sarah Bollier did her GPR thing, which was not done according to scientific standards. The press release, which was formulated on May 25th, was embargoed for 2 days, while sensitive journalists were given a copy of it. So it was a public relations strategy to get everyone thinking about this. The scoop was given to James Peters on May 27th, and then we did not hear from Sarah Bollier for a month and a half. So that announcement became ingrained in people's consciousness, and we cannot dislodge it to this day. Even though the band said on July 15th, that was Sarah Bollier said, remains have not been discovered. It's anomalies on the GPR that we have, targets of interest. And yet we have Ted Godfreyson Jr., we have the president of Thompson Rivers University, all continuing to say that the children are in their final resting place in this apple orchard. This is just not true, and it's highly improbable to be likely, because not one parent has said that their child never came home from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. We have research that is done by Nina Green and Jacques Riard. They have 49 deaths that are associated with the Kamloops Indian Residential School. This was done in a paper for the Dorchester Review by Jacques Riard with the research from Nina Green. We have 49 names. 25 of those names did not die at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. They died in hospitals, they died in their home reserves, and we have death certificates, I believe, for 38 out of the 49. They were all buried in reserve cemeteries. There's no mystery. What Kimberly Murray said, who's the interlocutor, who was paid millions of dollars to search for non-existent missing children, is there are no missing children. She said that. The children are in cemeteries where people don't exactly know where they're buried in the cemetery. That's the issue. And Romeo Saganash, who is the partner of Leah Gazan, he's an example of this. So his brother died at a residential school, Moose Factory, was buried in the cemetery there. His mother did not know exactly where in that cemetery he was buried, and this was found out a number of years ago, and she was told the exact plot where he was buried. And she did not want his body returned. She said she would see him again sometime, which we assume meant that she would see him in the what she perceived to be the afterlife. But that's generally what we're talking about, is that there are not, because of you don't have records of and the burials were marked. That's the other thing. They were originally marked, but the crosses have deteriorated, so now they're unmarked. That's definitely the case in Cowessus, which Cadmus Delorme said was a crime scene. It's not a crime scene. It's a cemetery where you had marked burials with crosses. Those crosses deteriorated, and they decided at some point, we're going to turn this old cemetery into a field, because these markers were all, willy-nilly and so on. That's not, no one should be surprised to find remains in a cemetery. That's what cemeteries are about. But it's being blown up into this because of this political objective to link that to some claim about genocide. That's what's happening. And it's not got validity to it at this time. Now, I could stand corrected if there's more evidence that's going to be presented. But what we have is people like Leah Gazan, Sean Carlton, Megan Sinclair, all these academics who are making accusations, trying to criminalize the work that people like me and the other members of this research group are doing, so that we can never get to the truth about what has happened. So we need excavations at Kamloops. They got $12.1 million, the band did, to do excavations. We've had 4 years waiting for this to happen. Ted Godfreyson Jr., Manny Jules of the Kamloops Indian Band said the 13 family heads had met, had decided to do exhumations. In order to do exhumations, and you have to have bodies to do that. You need excavations first before you do exhumations. We need the excavations to determine whether we need to do exhumations. If that is not done, that $12.1 million should be returned to the government, because that is why that was received. But it raises the question, why have those excavations not been done? And that should not be allowed to just, it doesn't matter. It matters a great deal, because there's a lot of things that have happened because of the assumption that there are the remains of 215 children who are buried in the Kamloops apple orchard. And that can't be a cemetery, because they have a cemetery on the Kamloops Band. There's in a reserve. They have, across from St. Joseph's Church, there is a there's a cemetery. So children who are buried legitimately will be in that cemetery or be in the other cemeteries that are associated with the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Yeah.
Just wondering if you could clarify the definition of genocide that you're.
So this is a very highly contested concept, as people are probably aware. And the question is, and I, in terms of, I'm saying in my paper that we haven't come to an agreement about this in political science. Many people use the Genocide Convention. So there's a couple things that are part of that. One is intent to destroy, so intent. And secondly is the 5 criteria, which is, mass killing, transfer of members of a group from one to another, depriving of the necessities of life, sterilizing. There's 5 of them. So that's one definition. The other one is cultural genocide. And it's not been decided whether cultural genocide is genocide.
Doesn't cultural genocide fall within those categories?
No. And in fact, it was
In terms of transferring children.
No, because it was, that's assimilation. So the residential schools, a number of people argue that it wasn't the forcible transfer as was assumed in the Genocide Declaration, or the Genocide Convention, because the children weren't taken from one group and put into another. Like they went home during the summer and they went back to their communities eventually.
Well, they're.
The other-
About residential schools, they went on for such a long time, and they were different in different times and different places for different people, right?
Yes. But in,
Very careful to not be
yeah,
talking about all of them as if it's the same
but
for
I,
150 years.
but I believe that the transfer, the forced transfer was done, all of this comes out of the Holocaust. So that's when the Genocide Convention got developed, was because of the Holocaust. And I believe it was due to children being taken away from Jewish families and put into German ones, and they were just raised in German households. And so it was like you're taking children and they're no longer part of the same family anymore. That was the context of that. In the residential schools, one thing that's interesting, which Nina Green has done a lot of research on, is you had applications to send your child to a residential school. That was often the case. Sometimes there were child welfare cases where children were taken out of those homes, but it was done according to the documentation because of the neglect and the problems, the family problems that existed in many reserves at that time. So, but that wasn't an intent to, according to this kind of argument, wasn't an intent to destroy. It was an attempt to, protect children in a child welfare context. So, but these, like in my paper, I'm just trying to say that the arguments being put forward by all these people who are making accusations of residential school denialism are not very clear.
I wonder too, if you've read Crystal Bridges' book.
I have not, no.
Just read
And what is the book?
By Strength We Are Still Here.
By Strength We Are Still Here?
Yeah, residential schooling.
I know she's one of the people who argues that residential school denialism is a thing.
She's a historian.
But she's like, there's 8 academics that I found who are making arguments that there's this thing called residential school denialism. I don't know what her view is on criminalization of residential school denialism. So not everyone who says that residential school denialism is a problem thinks it should be criminalized. The only one who I've specifically found has talked about this is Sean Carlton, who didn't used to think it should be criminalized, and now he thinks it should be criminalized. But in terms of her
Did
argument,
you read his book?
I've read his pieces on, the most famous article that he's written.
Noah's monograph with BBC Press.
No, I've read the stuff on residential school denialism.
Oh, okay.
And
Not
the,
on the residential school history that these folks
no,
are
I haven't, no.
writing about.
No. I've read his stuff on residential school denialism. And his academic paper on that, which was about Lynn Bayek, Senator Lynn Bayek.
I think it's hard to talk about relativization of the truth when we know that there's still so much that we don't know about the histories of those schools and records that are just missing or haven't been turned over.
Well, they're two different, there's people who think that there should be that truth is relative, and there's people who think that truth is a universal. And what you often find in these discussions about residential school denialism is when you try to get to the actual facts of the matter, you get hit with a relativist truth argument, which is you should believe survivors.
I think that's fairly broad.
Like, survivors should be believed because there's evidence to support what they put forward. If you're Billy Coombs and you're arguing that Queen Elizabeth II abducted 10 children, that should not be believed, because there's no evidence that Queen Elizabeth...
It's not violent.
No, but he's a survivor. If we're saying that you should believe survivors, you should...
Between the individuals and the academics, or even media reporting of the mass graves.
But the question is, should survivors just be believed because that's their truth?
But in the books that I've read about it, they back it up with
But then survivors should...
documentary evidence.
But they should be, if they have evidence to back up their claims, they should be believed. If they don't have evidence to back up their beliefs, it should just be an open question until evidence is presented. But that's not the claim, believe survivors, which is you just should believe them because they're survivors. That's their lived experience and so on. That's not enough evidence to have a universal conception of truth. So that's all I'm arguing.
Right.
I'm not saying, in fact, my view is you shouldn't disbelieve survivors. So survivors put forward their argument and we say, okay, you're putting forward this claim, now let's look at the evidence that would either support or sort of refute the claim.
Right.
That would be the way of reaching the universal truth on the matter.
And that's what these historians are doing.
Many of them go to the lived experience relativization of truth when you have a contestation that occurs. And you do see the blanket, you get people getting really angry when you say, I'm not going to just believe something because a survivor said it's the case. I'm going to need more than that. And that's the academic, you have a whole bunch of different pieces of evidence that you have to piece together in terms of these cases. And people who are remembering things from decades ago, there's problems with memory that need to be recognized. Plus a lot of pressures. There's many pressures that are on people as well, which has to be recognized. That's all I'm saying. I think it should be a much more thoughtful process that goes on, and I find the intimidation is not helping.
I would encourage you to check out Crystal's.
I've read some of her work. I haven't, and I'm not, I think that...
That's where you get the baseline from which they're coming at the question of denialism.
Yeah, but I'm doing a survey of the works on residential school denialism to try to figure out what's behind this claim. Like, why do people think...
It's hard to talk about denialism if you don't have the basic facts, the histories of the...
Well, my area of expertise is the Kamloops case, and I have studied this in an in-depth fashion over the last 4 years with 25 other people. So that's what I'm focusing on, but I'm very interested in this claim about residential school denialism, which to me does not make any sense at all. Because we are academics having disagreements about things which are quite complex, and people need to be engaged in saying, no, what is being said here is not accurate. But what the accusation of residential school denialism does is it shuts down that debate and makes people fearful that they're going to suffer some kind of accusation that they're upholding white supremacy or they're doing something that's just really negative, when it's like, as an academic, you have to be concerned about the facts.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I think I was expecting a bit of a different talk. I thought you were gonna talk more about the bill itself. And I'm just trying, I mean, yeah, so is the claim that if, and I have issues with this bill, I don't look into it too much, but is the claim that what you call the sort of relativistic notion of truth would be adopted by the courts in their application of legislation? That seems a bit maybe far-fetched to me. I'm not someone who has expertise on, hate speech jurisprudence, but
So there's two issues. One is the actual, if that bill passed. So you could have the bill passed without there being any court cases about it at all.
of course, yeah.
So,
I just mean in the application.
so in the bill passing, it would be, now you're not gonna have any discussion about this at all. Because everyone's gonna be afraid to get into that area that is not well defined. If you look at Leah Gazan's definition of what residential school denialism is, it's so vague, it could be a whole bunch of different, kinds of things. Like, Leah Gazan argued on January 20th that the remains of 215 children have been found in the county's apple orchard. She argued that herself. So she is misrepresenting, this is not a fact, this is an error, because it's not true. But because residential school denialism, the definition is not just facts being denied, but those facts are having a negative, denial of facts are having a negative impact on truth and reconciliation.
Yeah, but I think there's a distinction between what the academic literature is saying, and I'm more familiar with than I am, and how the courts would interpret this, right? Would they take this step?
Well, it'll be challenged under the Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for sure. It's more of a, for my understanding of what Gazan is doing, is intimidation. So it's just got a pure, I'm trying to send a signal to people. If you want to challenge what the views of survivors are and so on, you better watch it. That seems to me to be what's going on. If it actually got passed, which is possible, I guess, but it's to some extent it's a moot point because it's no longer on the books. But I'm hoping to send Leah Gazan a message to tell her, knock it off. Like, Canadians should not stand for this kind of intimidation that she is engaged in. And using compassion that people understandably feel about the situation of Indigenous people to push through her authoritarian types of measures. So that's really the thing. I hope now it's just not going to happen. And people just think twice about this. Because I don't think criminalizing speech is a good idea at all. If you're going to have incitement and so on, that's another matter. But, to say that you said something that's incorrect and therefore you should be put in jail is an absurd kind of type of initiative. Yeah.
Is there any, I may not have all this correct, but I think in Britain they passed a law criminalizing people saying anything against trans issues.
Mm-hmm.
And J.K. Rowling said, okay, I'll pay for anybody's legal expenses if you arrest them, and I don't know if anybody got arrested, but is that a similar kind of legal direction where you're stopping people from discussing that set of issues? Or trying to stop them, trans issues, like saying that, minors shouldn't be given puberty blockers or whatever the different topics of discussion are about that. But I believe they did pass that law, and I believe that they may not have gone after anybody yet, but
I'm not exactly sure. I've heard people talking about, I think it's called a non-criminal hate crime or something like that. It's some kind of odd thing where it's like got to do with the internet, and you say something about transgender issues. Yeah, I can't really speak to it because I'm not exactly sure. But I think the better one is the Holocaust denial bill. With that Bill C-22, I think, like that should never have been passed, in my view. Like it's a very. Pardon me?
What are the punishments?
I'm not sure, but I think it's similar kind of punishments. But again, they're linking it directly to hate speech, so they're saying detestation and vilification has got to be connected to it. But I don't know why they need a separate bill for that. Like we've already got a hate propaganda. It's called hate propaganda on the books. I'm opposed to that. I think the United States has got the best approach to freedom of expression matters, which is incitement. I think it's called the Brandenburg test. If you're inciting a criminal act, that's the problem, not just saying some, nasty thing, like which is like it just makes it very, very difficult to figure out what the boundaries are of detestation and vilification. When does it become detestation and vilification? That's kind of the difficulty. But I think in Canada, it's that C-22, which was the precursor. Like that's what gave Gazan, that gave her, that emboldened her. Because if you're going to do that for the Holocaust, why wouldn't you do this for the residential schools? That was kind of the logic about it. And as my view is, like, why are we even doing that about it? That was done a lot more undercover. Like it wasn't very, like no one really heard about that very much. It just kind of got passed as a part of some omnibus budget legislation. But that should be repealed because that's not good either to have that in there. We should, if people are going to be opposed to details about the Holocaust and have some theories about why that's the case, we should refute those ideas. We shouldn't be throwing people in jail for these kinds of arguments. I don't think that's a legitimate way to try to work through these things in a democratic society.
There are all these unofficial, extra-legal punishments, though, that seem to be being used very effectively in Britain and here.
Yeah, Britain is. I know that there's a lot of problems with the trans stuff in
Jobs,
Britain.
their friends turn against them. It becomes kind of a that will stop people saying anything very fast, and there'll be no discussions at all. I wonder in university classes, if people here are teaching, are the students speaking up as much as they used to in my day? They couldn't shut us up. But are they talking up? What issues are they? Did you bring up something?
Well, FIRE has done, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education has done surveys, and there's a lot of fear in the student body.
Yeah, that's what I've been doing too.
Because they're people, and it's not necessarily, it's about other students complaining about other students, about things that are said in class.
And I know professors get complained about. We've had friends who've had that happen to them. And fortunately without losing jobs, but with a lot of stress. I don't know what can be done about that part of the issue.
Yeah, well, it needs to be fought about. It needs to be fought against with everything that we have. Universities are academic spaces where you should be able to discuss all ideas, and this kind of clampdown that has been happening for the last. I've watched it. I started my working at Mount Royal University since 2008, and up until about 2015, I was never a popular figure. But everyone recognized I had my place within the university, and it was good sometimes to have a dissenting position. And then in 2020, everything fell apart. And now we do not have academic institutions anymore. We have equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is a major part, but that's not everything. The people who are pro-Palestinian also have serious problems in universities, which is another issue. And then we have general corporatization, which is, you know, if you say something against a university donor or these kinds of things, there's going to be problems with that. So universities have lost their way. They are no longer academic institutions in many, especially in faculties of arts, and people should take this very, very seriously. Universities are very important institutions, and if we aren't able to say what we think is true in a university, there's no other institution where that's going to be able to happen, because your job will be on the line if you try to do that in other contexts. And in universities, you didn't used to have those threats. You always had people complaining. That was always a problem, but no one listened to it. They just saw that as just the normal part of the hurly-burly kind of world of people getting upset about things. Why do people now listen to people get upset? Like, if people get upset, you know, you might say, okay, well, I've heard you now, but, you know, you're opposed to this view being expressed. That makes no difference. Like, you're entitled to be upset, but it's not going to stop that idea from being expressed. But now, you will be drawn into harassment investigations, and you will not win. And you will be stuck in a labor relations framework which will be unbelievably abusive. I went through 30 days, 30 hearing days, 8 days on the stand. Ridiculous things happened, and no one yet has said, hey, this is crazy, because of this whole climate that exists in the universities. But I will not give a thousandth of an inch on this.
The old imperial measurement. I think we are close to time. If there's other panels, there is one set of panels left today, so a bit of a difficult building to navigate.
Yes.
What's with the sloth? I'm a little fascinated. I like it. And is there some significance there?
It spends long stretches just snoozing and laying about, but there comes a time when a journey must be made.
Here's a two-point street.
So it is significant.
It
I
is.
can promise you, I can promise you it's not a CPSA screenshot. Not that.
I think it's a random Microsoft.
But it does have significance too. Anyway, I wanted to thank everyone for coming. I realize this was a, you know, it's not an easy conversation, but I think it's very, very important. I cannot stress its importance, and I really appreciate that everyone took the time to come here, and I appreciate everyone who is listening on the live stream.
Are there quite a few on the live stream, or?
There's a few. It usually gets viewed after the fact.